Big international story today. We're still waiting to hear from US President Donald Trump. He's expected to address the nation to discuss the confrontation with Iran, as we're all waiting to see if he and Tehran are headed for another war. As you would have heard this morning, Iran launching more than a dozen missiles at 2 Iraqi bases housing US troops. Now that's in retaliation for the killing of top General Qasem Soleimani. The Pentagon's confirmed the attacks on the Al-Assad air base, which houses US troops and coalition forces in the town of Erbil. Now, Trump tweeted, "All is well" after the attack, saying casualties and damage are being assessed. He is expected to comment any time now. Iran's telecommunications minister used Twitter to demand the expulsion of the US presence in the Middle East region. And the country's foreign minister tweeted that Iran does not seek escalation of war, but will defend itself. Well, let's chat now to our US correspondent, William Denslow. He's in New York for us. William, a very good evening to you, and evening on our side. So we're expecting to hear from President Donald Trump. What is your inkling about what he's likely to say?
Well, ahead of this address from the president, of course, there has been a number of hours since this attack. So what we can expect, what many analysts will certainly be hoping for, is somewhat of a measured tone coming from the president. Of course, there wasn't a volley of tweets coming from the president since that strike occurred. Just that one that you mentioned, stating that all is well. He also added in that tweet that the US has the most powerful and most well-equipped military in the world. Now, we have heard from Republican lawmakers who have called on the president to now seek de-escalation with Iran. So from many on both sides of the political aisle in Washington, and for citizens around the country, they'll certainly be hoping that that will be the tone expressed from the president.
Now, just looking at stories about the strike this morning and how we got to this point, William, many analysts or some experts believing that this missile strike by Iran might sort of end this conflict for now, but others warning that it might play out in other ways in the next couple of weeks and months. What's the feeling on the ground there? What's the feeling you're getting from experts?
Absolutely. Of course, there was a real fear ahead of this attack of exactly where and whether the Iranians would come good on their promise to retaliate. And of course, we're looking, and of course it's still very early, and there'll be plenty of assessments into these dozen or so ballistic missiles that were fired, and we'll be looking at whether this was a planned and concerted Iran to not target US troops, whether this was a purposeful act to strike areas that weren't populated with US servicemen and personnel, whether this was a case of missiles perhaps a misfiring. But certainly optimists will look at this and could well potentially interpret this from Tehran as a conscious decision to not target US personnel to avoid a loss of life if possible. So of course it's seen really by many analysts here in the United States that there is a real opportunity to de-escalate, considering there hasn't been, as far as we understand it, US loss of life. We've heard from the president saying all is well. We've heard, as you so rightly pointed out, Javad Zarif, Iran's foreign minister, stating that he's seeking escalation too.
All right, so William, I mean, this goes way beyond what happened this morning. Also, I suppose, what happened on Friday with the killing of Major General Qasem Soleimani. I mean, all of this going back to Donald Trump and sanctions and the nuclear deal. Just sort of bring us up to speed, or for anybody who might have missed out on what was going there behind the scenes with that deal, if you can just enlighten us.
Absolutely. Of course, Iran since then have said that they will stop complying with any part of that Iran deal. Of course, they have been continuously really taking steps away from it to, in terms of compliance with that deal. Of course, since the United States first announced they were pulling out of the 2015 landmark JCPOA Iran nuclear deal, there was efforts from the Europeans especially to try and keep Iran at the table to at least a certain extent, but it seems that that has rather fallen by the wayside, especially since the killing of Qasem Soleimani. So real questions will now be looked to see whether there will be an escalation. Of course, all eyes will certainly be on the president's address about what exactly relations can look like with Iran going from here. Of course, we've seen since the attack on Soleimani, we've seen an increase in US troops being sent to the Middle East. Of course, there are real concerns about the volatility in the Straits of Hormuz, of course, a passageway that accounts for around a fifth of the transportation of global oil supplies, over 22 million barrels of oil every single day. We've seen the likes of the British already said that they're going to take extra steps to protect their vessels passing through the Straits. Of course, there have already been 2 attacks in the Straits of Hormuz on oil tankers last year, with Tehran being blamed by Washington, Tehran denying. So there's certainly, despite whether there's an de-escalation now, there's certainly fears about what could happen next.
And, you know, we woke up to news of this plane crash as well, and Iran now saying that they are not going to be handing over the black boxes to any international investigators. Surely that adds fuel to the fire.
Absolutely, it just shows just how fraught these tensions are. Of course, very tragic event with 176 people confirmed dead, and of course this was a Boeing jet, so this is certainly a troubling escalation if the likes of Boeing and international investigators can't look into exactly what went wrong. But of course these tensions really fuel to add, and the real concern is what this means for the greater region. Of course there are threats of, if it's not a direct escalation between Iran and Washington, what this could mean for increased tensions by the US allies in the region, like Saudi Arabia, that of course constantly engaged in proxy wars with Iran in the likes of Yemen. So there are real fears that we could see an escalation in these tensions, not just between the US and Iran directly, but what this means for other players in the Middle East.
Well, I already see here that airlines around the world have been rerouting flights away from Iranian and Iraqi airspace. So some genuine fears out there, William. What have we heard from Iran's supreme leader about all of this, the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei? What does he have to say?
Absolutely. The message from the Supreme Leader, as we've heard over the last few days, is a very firm line indeed, that there is that this has been an escalation. We've seen an escalation in rhetoric coming from the Supreme Leader as well, saying that Iran will defend itself, it won't back down. They want to see the US withdraw from the Middle East. That a very firm line from Iran's Supreme Leader, and we can expect that rhetoric really to continue. I think it's fair to say, regardless of what the President says in this address, there is a real increase in tension, especially from those top officials. The killing of Qasem Soleimani was seen as a major blow for Tehran, so we can't expect to see a de-escalation in terms of rhetoric from the Supreme Leader anytime soon.
What's been the international reaction to all of this? What have we heard from? Has anybody taken sides in all of this? Who's taken whose side? And also from US allies?
Absolutely. I mean, the likes of the European allies have called for a de-escalation. This puts the likes of the Europeans in somewhat of a fragile issue. Of course, the US, as we've seen after the attacks on those 2 oil tankers last year, there were calls from the United States to build what they described as somewhat of a global coalition of partners to increase their military presence in the Straits of Hormuz and the wider region. The Europeans at the time really struggled to get on board with that to quite the same amount of appetite as perhaps Washington was hoping. But this, of course, very much puts further stress on the relationship between the likes of the European allies and the United States. We've already heard from NATO saying that they are reducing their presence in Iraq off the back of this escalation in tensions. Of course, sort of forget, as you so rightly mentioned, going all the way back to 2015, the Iran nuclear deal, and Washington subsequently pulling out of that deal. That wasn't something that the European allies wanted. They believed that Iran being part of this deal, bring them into the fold, was the best way to avoid them getting nuclear weapons, the best way to avoid tensions. But of course, Washington has seen things very differently indeed under the Trump administration. So while European allies will remain supporters of the US and, for the most part, their missions in the Middle East, this certainly does increase a conflict, at least behind closed doors, in a strategy point of view between those European allies and the United States.
Okay, well, we see that we're not sure what US President Donald Trump is going to tell us, whether he is going to try and be diplomatic, try and talk this through, or whether he's going to talk about further military action. But William Denslow, thank you very much. We'll keep an eye on as soon as we get word that Donald Trump is about to address the nation and the world. We will be bringing that to you. Still to come.